Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin E. Live in Paris every Friday here on France 24 with four top correspondents discussing the biggest issues of the last 7 days. In a week that will be, according to President Trump, remembered forever for what happened on Wednesday, T-Day, the day of the tariffs. Liberation Day, he called it, the term he also used to describe his election victory and his inauguration. But there's no denying the magnitude of it. Already causing international panic, a slump in global stock markets. Any company making products outside the US will now have to pay increased costs to import from Athens to Zurich. Notably, though, it doesn't include Russia. Western analysts say the maths behind the tariffs all seem a bit totted up, all a bit off the back of a fag packet. President Trump claims it's about fairness for Uncle Sam and warned others not to strike back.
European Union, they're very tough, very tough traders. You think of European Union, very friendly. They rip us off. It's so sad to see. It's so pathetic. 39%. We're going to charge them 20%, so we're charging them essentially half.
It's been a surprising week in French politics. A criminal court in Paris ruling Marine Le Pen ineligible to run for public office for the next 5 years, effective immediately after being found guilty of embezzling €4 million of EU parliamentary funds. The right-wing opposition leader was, up until now, frontrunner in 2027's presidential elections. Unbelievable, she uttered, as she stormed out of court before the judge had even finished reading the sentence. Her political dreams upended and now forced to wear an electronic tag for the next 2 years. Her anger visible Monday night primetime TV.
Ce soir, il y a des millions de Français qui sont indignés, mais indignés à un point inimaginable en voyant que, en France, dans le pays des droits de l'homme, des juges ont mis en place des pratiques que l'on croyait réservées au régime autoritaire.
And it's been a week that's seen Hungary roll out the red carpet for a leader wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu chanced his first European trip since being indicted in November in the knowledge his Hungarian counterpart Viktor Orban was withdrawing from the ICC and so wouldn't be obliged to arrest him on arrival.
You've just taken a bold and principled position on the ICC, and I thank you, Viktor. This is not only important for us, it's important for all democracies. It's important to stand up to this corrupt organization.
And it's been a week that's seen a crisis on top of a crisis in Myanmar. A nation is suffering from the effects of the biggest earthquake in a century and a military regime using the aftermath of the natural disaster for military advantage, bombing rebel-held areas, according to the UN, as well as reportedly blocking the flow of humanitarian aid and firing, too, on a Chinese Red Cross convoy trying to help victims of the earthquake. The overall death toll has now reached more than 3,000.
I welcome the announcement of temporary ceasefires. This is essential to help aid flow and let rescuers do their jobs.
So another Friday, another panel of the finest correspondents in their field. And thank you for joining us on The World This Week, live or on catch-up. The online version has been selected as being among the world's best 100 podcasts on current affairs. So here's our esteemed panel tonight. Joining us from Berlin, Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent for the New York Times. Stephen, always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you. And since you were last on, the EU has launched its advice on Europeans surviving in a time of potential war or crisis, and it includes stockpiling 72 hours worth of food and drink. Stephen, have you been following that advice?
I have not, but I have a very good supermarket across the street, so I'm not too worried about it.
If all else fails, you can nip across. Great to have you. Let's go from there to Nairobi. East Africa Deputy Bureau Chief for AFP, Eric Randolph, joins us. Eric, good to see you. I want to talk about Myanmar, because you've covered extensively over the years what's been going on there. What have you made with what's happening there in the aftermath of this earthquake?
Oh, well, it's very sad to see. It's been a little while since I was there. I was there just in the one positive moment that Burma had when it opened up for a couple of years. The military junta eased off for just a little bit, and there was a real moment of hope, and then it all went crashing back down again. I haven't been back since, and then as you said, to see it compounded again by this terrible tragedy and the military junta that never fails to do the worst thing possible has been particularly sad this week.
Eric, great to have you with us. In the studio, the acclaimed journalist and documentary maker Paul Moreira. Fantastic you're back with us, Paul. I want to talk about that because Eric just pointed out about Myanmar, the difficulties. You've travelled clandestinely before to Myanmar, notably for your documentary about Burma, the resistance that was going on there. You've been back and forth a number of times. As Eric said, a difficult place to report. International journalists since banned again from covering the aftermath of what's happened.
Yes, I mean, it's impossible to go there as a journalist, as we all know, but it's even difficult if you are a humanitarian to go on the field. So it makes things difficult for everybody. We have to say that the junta is really in a dire straits because the insurgencies are advancing and getting closer and closer to Mandalay, and it's noticeable that they are taking a revenge against them, profiting from the earthquake.
We still haven't seen what's happening in parts, for example, Sagayan, where some of it's rebel-held territory, close to the epicenter as well. We're hearing, I think, from the UN that they're sending in their envoy, Tom Fletcher, so we may get more details. Great to have you with us, Paul, as well. And that brings us on to talk about independent international journalists. We have the brilliant Anne Bagamarie with us, and it's a pleasure to have you on a Friday evening.
Gavin.
Talk to us about what's caught your attention this week.
Well, I mean, this is a period when I think it's tough to find a laugh in anything that you read or hear in the news. But I actually had a couple of good chuckles when I was seeing what was happening with the Trump tariffs that were announced. What made me laugh out loud was the way in which they were calculated. It's a straight arithmetical division of trade deficits that translate into percentage tariffs that supposedly the United States is owed. Even Republican economists say that it is a childlike and naive and ridiculous way to do it. So, you don't usually hear those words applied to high-level finance and economy in the United States. So that was pretty funny. The other is seeing Marine Le Pen, who has, with her conviction, claiming that she did nothing wrong and she doesn't understand why she's being persecuted. What made me laugh there is when you start reading the testimony, which is documentary testimony, emails and recordings, they got her banged to rights on what she did, on appropriating the money from the EU and spending it on her party. So that's pretty, I'm trying to think of a word I can say on television. That's pretty audacious of her to stand up and say, what are you talking about? Anyway, you look for laughs and smiles where you can, and that's where I found them this week.
And a good choice of word, and teased nicely what we're about to talk about. So let's start Wednesday, 1600 hours, Washington, D.C. Just after the US stock market had closed for the day, out came President Trump in the Rose Garden of the White House to unveil his self-promoted tariff plan, a plan he said that he was expecting would have presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens calling to beg him for the removal of it. Let's take a listen.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. Waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. We're going to make it wealthy, good and wealthy.
He came onto the White House with literal fanfare, then picked up for the theatrical moment his so-called league table of worst offenders. Territories, he said, have the biggest barriers on US goods. There have been a number assigned to each country, as Anne was talking about. So factors considered, including currency manipulation, alleged theft of intellectual property rights from the US, and the straightforward tot-up of products exported versus products imported. With all those things bundled together, they're given a notional percentage number described as tariff charges to the US. So for China, 67%, the EU deemed to charge 39% tariffs. And according to Team Trump, we just heard from Anne, out of their own goodwill, they halved that number to respond with their own reciprocal charges. So China gets 34% tariff on all products imported, the EU 20%. Unilateral surrender of the US is now over, he said. Anne, we'll come back to you first on that. President Trump talks about fairness, a visceral word that anyone all over the planet will go, I understand. Has he got a point?
No. No, to be honest. First of all, he misunderstands fundamentally what tariffs are about. He misunderstands fundamentally what trade deficits and surpluses are about. A relationship with another economy can be quite healthy if there is a large trade deficit with that economy. The economic relationship depends on so many more factors than how much you buy and how much you sell. But what Donald Trump, and I found a fascinating piece in the Wall Street Journal this week about it, to understand the way Donald Trump views relations, economic relations with countries, it's useful to remember that he is a real estate person at heart. And so he looks at transactions. We've always said he's a transactional kind of guy. He looks at transactions as what people owe, what the cards that they hold and what they owe to, in this case, the United States, or in his case, when he was either selling or buying property. And so he doesn't see nuance. He doesn't see a broader picture. And to him, looking at the amount of flow of goods and money between the two countries is enough to say whether you're getting a good deal or a bad deal. The problem is, of course, as many economists, including Republican economists, have pointed out, that when you start messing with that flow, when you start constricting trade between countries, you bring up costs for the consumers, because the consumers are eventually the ones who pay. I mean, the importers pay at first, but then they pass the costs on to the consumers. You sap productivity because you are putting a brake on the economy and workers feel as though they're spinning their wheels for nothing. And you sap creativity, because if you're contracting the world of economy versus expanding it, you're not leaving companies and brilliant people room to move. These are all things that the Trump administration claims it does not want to do. But here we are. It's doing them anyway. All because the president who's in charge of this has a vision limited to simple plus and minus.
But a simple plus and minus, Stephen says, and to which Donald Trump has also likened it to a patient that needs an operation that's very sick. Said it's going to get worse, the operation will have to recover, then things will get better. Quote, we always hear it, make America this time wealthy again, he says. What do you make of this? And also the way that the worst offenders are being worked out.
Well, I've noticed that Russia and North Korea are not included. That's the first thing you see. His allies, our allies, are being punished. That's obvious. Trump has said very bluntly that the European Union was designed to screw us over, he said. He sees his allies as basically geopolitical parasites. And he has been fascinated by tariffs for 40 years. I met him in the late 80s before he became a politician, and he was obsessed then about the way allies were taking advantage of the United States and being defended by the United States without paying money, and building their great social welfare systems and exporting their cars to America. And this has been outraging him forever. So he has a pretty simple idea, as Anne rightly said, and hello, Anne, of what tariffs mean and what the world economy means. But as one European parliamentarian I spoke to today said, it wasn't Liberation Day, it was Inflation Day. And it's going to hurt economic growth, particularly in the European Union, which is already having trouble with economic growth. And at the same time, he's demanding that the European allies inside NATO more than double their spending on the military. And they will have to do that, ideally, if they do it, from a lower economic base. So it's a little bit contradictory and self-defeating. It also raises the question of whether he really wants to remake the world, to remake our relations with the world, or does he want to open a big bargaining session and have everyone come crawling to him asking for lower tariffs? And that's a serious question, which I think quite a lot of European leaders are still trying to figure out.
He talked a lot. I don't know if he talked about this with you back in the 80s, about William McKinley. You know, it goes back to all that time ago, a century ago, when he talks about the tariff king and how trade was very different. On the long view on this, Stephen, your thought that, you know, he wants to break, his key supporters say, that hold that China will eventually have, and you have to really seriously disrupt the financial system. And he believes that this is one key way of getting business into the States. Do you see a crumb of truth in that?
Well, there's a crumb of truth to it. I mean, China has been taking advantage without question of the world financial system and the world trade system. It's still considers itself and wants to be treated as a developing country inside the WTO, even though it is really quite a very rich and growing richer country. And China is, unlike Russia, is a peer rival of the United States, not just economically, but militarily. And Trump came into office saying he wanted to deal with China. But one could do that without clobbering your European allies, let alone poor Mexico and Canada, who had been living with a free trade agreement that Trump himself had renegotiated in his first term in office. So my guess is that he doesn't believe, as you know, in multinational institutions, whether they're NATO or the United Nations or the WTO. He doesn't like the European Union, partly because of its regulatory power and its power over trade and tariffs. And I think he's trying to divide it. Now, he also says he wants all this money to give tax breaks to the United States. So if you listen to him, it's not really so much about unfairness. It's about getting your allies to subsidize tax breaks for Americans.
Eric, listening to Stephen, we've heard about the EU a lot, about China and the triage of information in the past, not even 48 hours on. We're hearing less about other countries affected. Perhaps you want to tell us a bit about what you're picking up in terms of African countries affected by these potential tariffs heading their way.
Yeah, I mean, we saw one of the most absurd moments of the announcements was that the tiny country of Lesotho has got one of the highest tariff rates in the world at 50%. And that's because it makes a lot of clothes for the American market under a scheme that was set up 20 years ago by the Bush administration, the AGOA Act, African Growth and Opportunities Act, which allowed African countries to make stuff and sell it tariff-free into the American market. And they make a lot of Wrangler jeans and Levi's. And I actually went to one of those factories in Kenya just a couple of weeks ago, and they were very much hoping that the AGOA Act was going to be renewed, because it's unfortunately for Africa up for renewal this year. So that was already hanging in the balance even without these tariffs, and now it looks dead in the water. Those factories, the factory I visited has been there for 20 years, and I met some of the employees. It's turned a very rough area of Nairobi into a much nicer area. It gives jobs to 10,000 people in a country that's desperate for that kind of manufacturing jobs. Overall, the picture for Africa isn't that bad. It doesn't actually sell that much stuff into America. It sells, I think, 40 billion a year. Dollars, which is equivalent of about a month of Mexico and Canada. But for those little places like that factory, which I visited, and there are lots of them all over America, closing those down can have a devastating impact on communities at exactly a moment when America has also cut a gigantic amount of aid into Africa, which is going to send a lot of African budgets for healthcare into a tailspin. And of course, those countries are also dealing with enormous debts already. So we've really got a kind of perfect storm that's being created. And the other factor in all of this is that America is losing a huge amount of soft power in Africa because of these things that it's pulling away. I'll just add one last little thing, which is what's interesting is talking to a lot of Africans this week about it. The common refrain you hear is not anger at America. It's anger at their own government for having become so dependent on America over many years.
It's a very good point, actually.
A chance to break that complacency of their leaders.
Which takes us on, Paul, to kind of looking at a solution here for Europeans. Is a solution to kind of do what Canada has been doing, to buy local, to take... The Canadians have been taking US products off their own supermarkets as a way of striking back. And we're seeing Trump is not adverse to negotiations here, is he?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you look at what he has done to Mexico, for example, he has threatened Mexico right when he arrived with heavy tariffs, and then he stepped back. And somehow I believe that there's also a leverage issue with those high tariffs. There's the leverage issue that he can, like, for example, fly drones, CIA drones over Sinaloa to see if he spots fentanyl labs. We have learned about that, like, 2 weeks ago. Probably that's also something he can use, the fact that he's threatening with tariffs. But something I want to say is that I was in the US, in West Virginia in July this year, and I was appalled by the factories that were closed, like ghosts and I was remembering when I was a kid, I used to buy flannel shirts in New York where it was written on the label, crafted with pride in the USA. And it's impossible nowadays to buy any type of garment where there's this label existing. So there is also this magical thing about Trump that is sending the message to the domestic audience that, I put tariffs and you'll see factories will spring up from West Virginia, and it's the renewal of something that everybody's expecting now. So it's a very like a shaman dance that is doing for the American public so that they believe that something very magical is going to happen from these tariffs.
And with it, and the public rhetoric that there is something that can benefit the US with a negotiation. So let's look at TikTok, for example. That being potentially this weekend, it will either be sold or banned. That's another deadline coming up. The Chinese are being told that if ByteDance sell it, there may be a better tariff deal that you can have. And talking about viral things, you talked about trying to make the light of the situation. One of the big things to take off on social media, including on TikTok, was this tiny little island of Heard and McDonald Islands, somewhere off the coast of the Antarctic, to which, it's a rocky outcrop with few penguins, and they've been slapped with 10% tariffs. So the penguins are up in arms about that, we're told. The Guardian have picked up on it as well. Nowhere on earth is safe, it says. I think Saint-Pierre-Miquelon as well, French overseas territory, 99% tariffs because they've sold, 6,000 people there, they've sold more goods and hardly received any.
Yeah, that's the ridiculousness of the calculations. I'm really happy that you brought up China. Because, of course, one of the things that Business Reporter, most of my career has been in business journalism. One of the first things we do when we look at a story about an industry or a company or about an economy is who's helped, who's hurt. Okay, who benefits from this? Who is likely to be hurt by this? The jury is very definitely out as to whether America is going to be helped in the long run, as President Trump says. There will be pain. There is already pain now, but he claims it'll all be worth it because later we'll be much healthier and much wealthier. But who's helped in the short term? It's China. I think listening to Trump talk about the cards and the negotiating position, he believes that America is the biggest consumer economy in the world and people should pay to have access to it. That's not a bad way of thinking about it if you're a real estate guy. But if you look at the whole board, if you look at the fact that trade is global and countries do have an option to buy someplace else in the United States, where are they going to go? Mm-hmm. Presumably, they could come to the European Union. It's an enormous trading bloc as long as the EU maintains its unity and acts as a trading bloc. But then there's China. Mm-hmm. What is to say that once the tariffs are slapped on Chinese goods and those Chinese goods are no longer sold in the U.S., that they're not going to be sold somewhere else that will benefit it? In Lesotho, for example, or poor Myanmar, which needs help in all kinds of ways, especially with its economy and its aid. Who says they're not going to go to China for that? Africa is already more tied to China than it's ever been before. Mm-hmm. So be careful what you wish for and look at the whole board would be my message to the American administration, but they're not asking, and it doesn't sound like they're listening to anything but Donald Trump's gut.
Well, let's move from Donald Trump's guts from the Rose Garden on Wednesday. Let's come here to Paris, 10 o'clock Monday morning at the Paris Correctional Court. 24 defendants in the dock, all members of the far-right National Rally Party, including its leader, Marine Le Pen. The verdict, delivered 13 years after allegations first emerged of a €4 million embezzlement scheme involving the use of funds allocated for aids at the European Parliament for EU staff. But it was actually paying staff in France for roles completely unrelated. The court ruled Marine Le Pen was at the centre, the heart of it. She orchestrated it, devised fake contracts for staff, including her sister, that worked for the party in France, but under the guise of an EU job. And as the sentencing was read out, Le Pen didn't stick around to hear the detail. 4-year sentence, suspended, electronic monitoring tag to be worn for 2 years, €100,000 fine. The real shock, she's ruled out of running for public office for 5 years. The presidential frontrunner in all recent polls no longer allowed to stand. A judicial system being used as a political weapon, a livid Marine Le Pen told the French broadcaster TF1.
La motivation de la présidente est claire. Je ne veux pas que Marine Le Pen puisse être élue présidente de la République. Rendez-vous compte, le jour funeste, ce lundi 31 mars 2025, le jour funeste que cela représente pour notre démocratie et pour notre pays, où des millions de Français vont être privés par un juge de première instance, sans recours possible, de la candidate qui est aujourd'hui donnée comme étant la favorite de l'élection présidentielle.
So Marine Le Pen will look to appeal, including at the highest court in France for an emergency hearing. There is talk from the head of the judicial judges' body saying that there could be an appeal before June 2026. The Prime Minister, meanwhile, François Bayrou, let it be known to sources around him, though noting it wasn't recorded, that he was uncomfortable with the decision. He found the ruling, quote, troubling, particularly the immediacy of the 5-year ban. Marine Le Pen, meanwhile, still holds a key role in the continuation of his minority government. Let's start with you, Stephen. What are your thoughts on how the week has played out and the rights to appeal that she now has?
Well, I've spent 6 years living in France covering it. I've watched French justice in many ways. To say it doesn't have a political element, I think, would be naive. So the timing of this is interesting to me. I don't doubt the evidence. I mean, as far as I can tell, she's guilty of doing this. I have to be careful here, but I think UKIP in Britain used very similar methods to finance itself through the European Parliament. I am also, like François Bayrou, a little troubled by the immediate ban on political activity, I have to say. I think it's going to boomerang. If Macron said he was elected to make sure the far right doesn't come to power, I think this is a problem for France. Now, I don't know what the judges will do. I don't know what the appeal will be. The judges had, as I understand it, the possibility of finding her guilty and making her do everything, but without necessarily banning her from political life. And I'm not here to judge the judges, but I do think politically for France, it creates a real difficulty. And my hope is, just for the sake of a decent election, that she is allowed to run in 2027, because if she doesn't, I fear the backlash will be extraordinary.
Very interesting. But the points that Nigel Farage now at Reform, as you said, formerly UKIP. Notably, he said this week there are many other parties that will have questions in Europe, not just far-right parties. He denied any accusations of his own party. And on the other point you raised, Stephen, as well, we're already seeing, actually, aren't we, protests planned for this weekend in support of the National Rally, also against Paul. You've looked a lot over the years at National Rally and its predecessor. You've interviewed Marine Le Pen, his father, Jean-Marie Le Pen as well. Are we seeing, this is a party in crisis management mode now, clearly. Are we going to see kind of the imminent crowning of Jordan Bardella as the presidential candidate in reserve?
I hope not. I also interviewed Jordan Bardella as a kid. I mean, he's obviously not fit for the role. But I must say that also what makes French giggle sometimes about this story is that the National Front, former Rassemblement National, was the most adamant party, saying, you know, tête haute, main propre, we keep our head high because our hands are clean. And then comes this, and Marine Le Pen has repeatedly said that any elected politician that would be convicted of having stolen public money should never be able to present himself or herself in front of the citizens. And of course, everybody is digging up those old videos where she's asking very, she really believes in what she's saying. And then all of a sudden, it's an incredible attack against freedom of expression. I do agree that it may not be a good idea that she would not be able to be a candidate in 2027 in terms of public peace, let's say. But nevertheless, she is guilty. I mean, the judges have done a thorough work, and they have 150 pages of investigation backing their decision. And you cannot steal the money of the citizens and then pretend that you're attacked for freedom of expression. It doesn't fit in anybody's head.
Very interesting, Anne, also, is the stability of the government right now, because we only have to rewind back towards the end of last year, November time, where there was a different Prime Minister. It was Michel Barnier, and it was back then that the prosecutor first set out that he was seeking a penalty of a 5-year ban from public office. Mm-hmm. What happened days later? She withdrew the support, the government fell. There is a risk now, isn't there, that François Bayrou is on very thin ice?
Well, he's on thin ice in another way. I mean, he was brought up on very similar charges to Marine Le Pen several years ago. He was acquitted.
He's related to the EU funds as well.
Related to the anal funds and being channeled to his political party. He was acquitted. The prosecutor has appealed, and that appeal date has not been set. Mm. So he finds himself in a glass house, wondering how he can possibly throw stones without hitting himself. To the point about the French political system being politicized, I completely agree with Steve. Hi, Steve. But I also want to point out that the very fact that the Paris Court of Appeal has agreed to hear the appeal on an accelerated basis is the reason why there'll be a judgment and then the Court of Appeal has said that they could have a hearing and a judgment by the middle of 2026. That is plenty of time in France's accelerated, abbreviated campaign cycle for the presidency for her to present herself. This is an accelerated cycle. It was done most likely because she is a prominent person and because of the risk that this could be seen as a political prosecution. So, on the one hand, she is complaining about something that is actually working in her favor. So it's a very Trumpian landscape. I mean, to claim that you're being persecuted by the judicial system, but then you're also benefiting in some ways from the fact that you are prominent and have criticized the system. We'll see. My bet, and I have no crystal ball in this, but my bet is that the appeal will be heard on an expedite basis precisely to allow her to face the voters and to let the French people decide whether or not she should be president. But let's be clear about this. This is not necessarily a validation of the rule of law. This is actually, in some ways, a twisting of the rule of law to favor a powerful person with a platform.
Yes, and to which sources within the Élysée may say judicially, it is a wicked web we weave when we practice to deceive, but the extent of the ban is in question. Eric, you as Paris correspondent for AFP here a long time have looked at this issue over the years as well. We're in a position, aren't we, where we're now seeing the most powerful person in the world get involved, President Trump, saying, quote, "This is a witch hunt. Free Marine Le Pen." Free from what? I don't know. Maybe the tag that she's on. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I think the real problem, and we've already touched on the fact, Stephen said that this could boomerang against the mainstream political class, but it really fits into Trump and J.D. Vance's line of argument that Europe is a place of censorship, that it's trying to silence right-wing voices. And it comes, unfortunately, for France and hot on the heels of the Romanian presidential candidate who was barred from office, barred from standing for election just a few weeks ago. And so this fits into their worldview perfectly. And I think the biggest problem France has got is how many people are really going to be looking into the minutiae of the charges and the case that was made against Marine Le Pen, and how many people are going to just rationalize, her supporters are just going to rationalize away the case against her, or not even know the details and just assume, as they're being told by Trump and Musk and many others, that she is being purposefully scapegoated and sidelined for political reasons, and it will make her a martyr. And that's a very dangerous thing to have going into an election season.
It is, Stephen, just a brief word from you on that, on Eric's thought, Stephen, in Berlin, which is, if we go back a few months to, well, uncertain times in Britain, when we had that famous Daily Star picture of a lettuce which outlasted the Prime Minister at the time, Liz Truss, was about 47 days. She lasted around 46. So François Bayrou has been in office for approximately 3 months and 22 days now, probably 3 lettuces worth. Anne thought, actually, he's unstable ground for 2 reasons. How long do you give this current government, which is supposed to last, until, well, at least the summer?
Well, there's an intriguing question because under the judge's ruling, if there are new elections, then Marine Le Pen can't run for those either. So it may give Bayrou more time, frankly. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I'm not a predictor of this. I think France needs a government. He seems, tolerable to the bigger parties for the moment. It's always good to have a weak prime minister because you can push him or her around. So I think that in a way argues for a longer term, both those things. But here I really claim no particular expertise.
Well, it takes us to a friend of Marine Le Pen now. Let's talk about what's been going on in Budapest. 1:45 in the morning, Thursday, is when the Israeli Prime Ministerial aircraft, the Wing of Zion, touched down in the capital in Hungary. It was a red-eye flight. The red carpet rolled out in the early hours for a leader who is a wanted man in the International Criminal Court. Bearing in mind that protocol dictates a member state has a duty to handcuff, arrest, transfer to The Hague in this scenario. Well, news emerged shortly after sunrise that Viktor Orban had triggered the process for Hungary to leave the ICC, that he stands with Benjamin Netanyahu and shares his view the organisation is biased, corrupt, and that the war crime allegation charges against Mr Netanyahu are baseless.
Why was the Prime Minister of the State of Israel not arrested despite the International Criminal Court expectation? I can give you three answers. The first is that it is not our habit. In Hungary, we don't arrest our guests. The second is that we didn't want to do that. Israel is our friend, and the purpose of the foreign policy for a country is to gather friends, and that's good. Israel is not Hungary's enemy, and it is not even an indifferent country, but a friend. The third thing is, even if we had wanted to arrest him, we would not even have been able to order the police to make an arrest because we never made this international treaty part of the Hungarian law. So we can say that the Prime Minister was 1,000% safe in Hungary.
You've just taken a bold and principled position on the ICC, and I thank you, Victor. This is not only important for us, it's important for all democracies. It's important to stand up to this corrupt organization.
And let's start with you. What's your reading of events, the early morning flight? What's going on?
What's going on? Well, I'm actually more interested in what's going on with Orban than I am with Netanyahu, because he clearly didn't take this step without knowing that once he got to Hungary, he wouldn't be arrested. So obviously that was a deal that was made. Hungary is a founding member of the ICC. And even though Orban has said that he wants to leave, under the rules, the Hungarian parliament has to approve that move, and probably will. It's all controlled by his party. But then they have to wait a year. It's like Trump saying he wants to leave the WHO, the World Health Organization. He can say it all he wants, but the U.S. is still a member until it leaves. So Hungary is still a member until it leaves. This is personality, autocratic ruling par excellence by Orban. He doesn't think he needs to arrest someone who has been charged with crimes by the ICC because he doesn't want to. He doesn't feel like it. Now, the matter of enshrining this in Hungarian law, not so sure about that. It's very possible that under the new Orban regime, that slipped through the cracks or that has been somehow. But Hungary is a part of the ICC. So this is pretty clearly an opportunity for Orban to stand up and say, I stand with those who prefer governments of men and not of laws. It's a small but growing group. I think the U.S. is joining it slowly and surely. And, I also think that because the ICC has come into some fire for for not political reasons, but the chief prosecutor, Mr. Khan, has been accused of sexual improprieties with someone who worked for him. It's a tough moment for the ICC in that respect. And there's been a lot of talk about how Hungary is exploiting that moment. And those who, like Netanyahu, would not like to accept the authority of the ICC are exploiting that to say the organization is corrupt. So I find it pretty much on brand for Orban to stand up and say, I know that there are these constraints and guidelines for what I'm supposed to do, and I'm simply not going to do them.
And yet, given what Anne said, Stephen, this is not, when it comes to European leaders, this is not a black and white issue, is it? When you look at the German government, they've been quite ambiguous. In fact, I think I'm right in saying, Stephen, that Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor-to-be, said he'd find ways and means to accommodating and welcome Netanyahu to Germany.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the heart of this is the war in Gaza and how people view the war in Gaza and whether people view Israel under Benjamin Netanyahu has committed not just war crimes, but genocide, which is part of what the ICC has charged him and others with. Now, that has produced outrage in the United States, at least among the government. The ICC has been sanctioned, its people have been sanctioned before all this. So it becomes a deeply complicated issue about your attitude toward the state of Israel, its legitimacy, and its actions fighting off Hamas. Now, having said that, you know, Trump and Orban are also very much opposed to these international organizations that pretend to provide their values for everyone else. I mean, that's the way they view it. But I would say it's the same Viktor Orban who keeps using George Soros in anti-Semitic fashion as some sort of paper target for all of his grievances. So the contradiction between supposedly loving Israel and using anti-Semitic tropes against George Soros is something Orban obviously lives with, but I think it should be pointed out.
And Paul and Eric as well. Paul first, we've got about a minute each, but both of you, over your careers, you've explored themes of war, corruption, human rights abuses in your journalism. First of all, Paul, let me ask you the same question, starting with you. What is your take on what we're seeing? This argument being framed that it's the prosecutors in The Hague, as Anne said, that are corrupt, used by Netanyahu to attempt to dismiss any credibility of the grave charges against them, and to what effect it might be working.
Yeah, my feeling is that there is this trend, as you mentioned, of the nationalist acts where America is part of now, of breaking down any kind of architecture, global architecture. They're against the globalists. Anything that has been built after the Second World War to try to have a global justice system or something that can maybe counterbalance acts of barbarity. This is going to be thoroughly deconstructed by these axes, and we have to await more and more attacks against UN agencies and everything that was built up after the Second World War to try to avoid the worst. I foresee a lot of events like this one. A
potential threat of collapse given an axis being used. Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with the ICC has always been that it has always been inadvertently a political organization because it's so limited by the fact that lots of countries have never been members. Key countries like the US and China have never been members. And if there's an Africa angle here, which is that Africans do see the ICC as targeting their citizens more than others. In fact, I might be wrong about this, but I believe that the vast majority, if not all, of the convictions that have been secured at the ICC have been of African citizens. I think we're just seeing the unraveling of a system that was always extremely vulnerable to the vagaries of political power, and people are just exploiting that reality.
Very interesting. We're seeing it in the Philippines at the moment, Duterte facing allegations in The Hague, but also there's political usefulness for why he would be there right now. Very, very interesting. Thank you all for your invaluable insight, unique context and colour from our panellists tonight. In Berlin, Stephen Erlanger, Chief International Correspondent for Europe for the New York Times. Thank you, Stephen. In Nairobi, the East Africa Deputy Bureau Chief we just heard, Eric Randolph for AFP. Great to have you back with us, Eric. And here in the studio, the renowned independent journalist Anne Bagamarie. And thank you, the acclaimed documentary maker as well, Paul Moreira. Thank you too. We'll end where we began, with a note on Trump and his tariffs, the effect of the tinier territories that got caught up in his carte blanche approach. We're going to leave you with the reactions of the locals of Heard and McDonald Island, an inhibited outcrop of only bird life and penguins who've not escaped being slapped Trump tariffs either. This is how it's being played out on social media this week. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in 7 days for The World next week.
Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith.
All the latest in politics, economics and the arts in Africa on France 24. Our journalists are in every region, every country, to report on the emergence of a continent of unparalleled riches, bringing you Africa's stories on France 24.
Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Liberté, égalité, actualité. France 24, your economy explained. Liberté, égalité, actualité.
France 24 embraces digital. The best way to stay informed. Live blogs following international news in real time. The latest news in 5, 10 or 15 minutes. France 24, your first choice for news.